So this is going to be a timeline of the Civil Rights Movement. We're going all the way back to the 13th Amendment, right after the Civil War. Freeing the slaves, 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law and citizenship, and then universal male suffrage. We have a few cases in between, but the big one, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, that establishes separate but equal, and this legalizes segregation. In the 1890s, we have those Jim Crow laws that we've talked about, and this is going to be prominent throughout the southern states, even California. Jim Crow laws actually, not just black people, but Mexicans and Asian. Then you have a series of important court cases, but the big one is this 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, and then we have the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, so it rules that schools must be integrated and public transportation cannot be segregated. James Baldwin was a very important author. He was born in the South, experienced Jim Crow as a young man, moved to the North, and experienced de facto segregation in the North. And he is going to write essays, and basically he's talking about if something isn't done to stop this discrimination, that violence would ensue, and he kind of predicted what was going to come in the future. In 1955, this young boy, 14 years old, from Chicago, Illinois, travels down to stay with his uncle in Cousins in Money, Mississippi, while his mother goes to nursing school. And it's said that he whistled at a white woman in a store. He is taken from his uncle's home. He is beaten brutally. He is tortured, and then he is killed, wrapped in chains, and dumped in the Tallahatchie River. His body is not recovered for several days. They ship the body back, and his mother insists on this open casket. Jet magazine takes pictures of it, and at the trial, the uncle identifies the two guys that took him, and the woman who said that he had whistled at her lies and said she was afraid he was going to rape her, this little 14-year-old boy. And it took them just about the time it took to drink a Coke and smoke a cigarette, this all-white male jury, to find these two not guilty. Now, because of Jet magazine and because of the pictures from the funeral, this is going to be an impetus for the NAACP and for people to become aware of the violence and the discrimination that was going on. So this is Brown versus Board, and the man who argued Brown versus Board of Education is here on the left, Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall ultimately is going to become a Supreme Court justice. But he works for the NAACP as an attorney for many years. You can see this is a famous quote that separating children solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds. And that is the Warren Court. So just because they say, that doesn't mean it gets done immediately. There's several civil rights organizations that are going to have different goals and different types of protest, and this is CORE. It's an older one, Congress of Racial Equality, and it's going to organize sit-ins. Again, this is going to be a non-violent group, and their strategy is going to be non-violent protest. We saw the video on Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, so about a year after Brown versus Board and Emmett Till, that is when Rosa Parks decides not to give up her seat, and she is the perfect person for this. So after 381 days of boycott, the Supreme Court will rule that there will be no more segregation on public transportation. And this establishes Martin Luther King as a leader in the movement. You can see how young he is here. He is influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, who, of course, nonviolent protest in India, and by Henry David Thoreau, who believed in civil disobedience, Mexican War. He did not pay his taxes in protest of the Mexican War. In 1957, Central High School is going to test the integration of public schools. And so Little Rock, Arkansas, Central High, 9 students are kind of hand-picked. They're very good students. They're given training in, again, nonviolence, and they try to enter Central High School. They're turned back the first time they try it, and then President Eisenhower will nationalize the National Guard, instruct them that they need to protect these students, and then, just to be on the safe side, he sends in the 101st Airborne to accompany these students. You can see the crowd here, and this is right outside of Central High School. The woman here on the far right actually was a good woman who protected one of the students who was trying to get away to a bus stop. And you can see the people in the background kind of screaming at her. Another organization, the Sncc, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It's college students, and again, nonviolent, and they are going to continue on with the sit-ins and organize the freedom rides. You can see it's very difficult to be nonviolent. They're getting milkshakes poured on their head, ketchup in some cases, sometimes dragged off the counter, the seats. And you can see white students sitting with black students protesting and not being served at these drugstores. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is Martin Luther King's organization, and this is a group of preachers throughout the South, and that was the meeting place. That was the safe place for people to come and organize their protests. Edgar Evers had been a veteran in World War II. He was decorated. He was a family man, had a couple of kids, lived in Jackson, Mississippi, and he is going to be a leader in the NAACP. He is going to be brutally killed in his own driveway. He had just gotten a whole bunch of t-shirts printed, and a guy named D. La Beckwith is going to be hiding out behind a bush and shoot him right in front of his own home. And he becomes a martyr for the cause. The t-shirt said, "Jim Crow must go." They find the weapon. He's arrested. The jury does not find him guilty. And 30 years later, when things had changed a little bit and when the federal government gets involved, finally doesn't leave it to the states with these civil rights cases, he is tried again and found guilty. Sent to prison, and he spends 7 years in prison and ultimately dies in prison at age 80. So finally justice is done. It just took a very long time. Okay, we talked about some of the sit-ins before. The most famous sit-in is in Greensboro, North Carolina, the Woolworth Drugstore. Now, these are going to be organized across the country. They actually had a sit-in here in Shreveport, Louisiana. and 54 different cities, and ultimately Woolworth instructs all of their stores that no more segregation, that anyone who sits at the counter would be served. So this was a successful protest. In 1960, we had a very, very, very close election. You can see here, the popular vote was minuscule, the difference between the Republican Richard Nixon and the Democrat John F. Kennedy. And the electoral vote, again, fairly close. He wins with 56% of the vote, and you can see how it's kind of spread out in this country. We have the Democratic South, except for Mississippi and Alabama, and they went for a guy named Byrd. They called him KKK Byrd, because he had been a former KKK guy. And Nixon takes most of the West, and it came down to actually Illinois, and some of that was disputed, so we know about disputed elections. But Kennedy's going to get 70% of the African American vote, and that is, he had reached out to Martin Luther King and prior to the election, and he got Martin Luther King's endorsement. We've always heard about this first television debate. Nixon wins if people were just listening on the radio, but John F. Kennedy, he looked so good on TV, and he had TV makeup, and he had gotten coached on how to do it, and he is going to squeak through and win this 1960 election. So he's the youngest elected president at 43. Remember, our youngest president was 42, Theodore Roosevelt, but he got there by virtue of McKinley being assassinated. John F. Kennedy's our first Catholic, and his famous quote in inauguration, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." His wife was much younger than him, about 30, I believe, and she spoke fluent French and was quite fashionable and kind of changed the whole look of a first lady. He had been a war hero in World War II. So these are the freedom rides starting in 1961 to try and register people to vote. And you can see the routes they take. We actually had this one that's in the blue on the far left that went through Shreveport, Louisiana, and they would go to these different bus stops, and they still had the signs up colored and white, and they would go, it's not supposed to have any segregation on public transportation. These are mostly Greyhound buses and cross-country buses, and they would go into these facilities. Some of them were met with violence. So the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Supreme Court had said no segregated facilities. They still were in existence, and this was the test. Many of these riders were arrested, and then some of them were actually beaten. In this particular case, the bus was it was Molotov cocktails, and they'd wanted the people inside to actually burn to death, but luckily another vehicle had come up behind, and the people who were going to keep them inside the bus fled, and they were rescued, but it was a very close call. The Ku Klux Klan was actually issued a restraining order for what good that did. So another veteran, he is trying to get into the University of Mississippi, and he is again a great student. He had been honorably discharged from the Army, and when he gets accepted from the University of Mississippi, it's like, oops, I'm sorry, we did not realize you were a black person, and they say no. Well, he goes anyway, and the governor tries to stop him. Kennedy ends up sending in troops. There's a building that is burned down, but he is protected, and he actually graduates 1 year later in 1963. But he is the first black man to attend the University of Mississippi. All right, we saw the video about Birmingham, and of course this is one of the pictures of them using that high pressure fire hoses. You can see 3 firemen are holding the hoses as these young children, the Children's March, are trying to integrate Birmingham. This is a famous picture of the dog attack. At University of Alabama, some of you might have seen Forrest Gump. There's an attempt to integrate, and this is George Wallace, the governor, who says segregation now, segregation forever. He's going to change his tune when he runs for president and say, whoops, didn't really mean it. But he also tries to block entrance to the school. The federal government and John F. Kennedy are going to fine him large amounts of money if he does not allow these students to come in, and he will capitulate. So once again, troops are sent in to protect these two new students, and it's Vivian Malone and James Hood, and he is going to succumb to the pressure. You see him blocking the entrance. In August of 1963, a march on Washington is organized. They expected a few people to show up, and it turns out like 250,000 people show up. This is probably the most famous march on Washington ever, and we've talked about several marches on Washington. You can see this is the crowd stretching across the reflecting pool. And Martin Luther King is going to make his famous "I Have a Dream" speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So this was about jobs and opportunity. You can see the crowd here. It was peaceful, and Kennedy is going to take notice. The legislator is going to take notice. He does propose a Civil Rights Act, but Kennedy is unable to get it passed. And here we have Martin Luther King. As a result of this, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, and this is passed after the assassination of John F. Kennedy by Lyndon Johnson in the legislature. No discrimination based on color, race, religion, sex, or national origin in voting, employment, or public services. No discrimination in public facilities, in government, and in employment, and no poll taxes or literacy tests for voting. They didn't think they'd gone far enough with these Civil Rights Acts, so a march is going to be organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference from Selma to Montgomery. And the first attempt at this march is going to be met with violence on the bridge. You've probably seen pictures of this. Famous legislator and civil rights leader John Lewis is going to be beaten, and they are forced back, but they will ultimately make the So the Civil Rights Act is actually the Voting Rights Act, and if a state has fewer than 50% of their eligible black voters registered, the federal government is going to take over. And this actually is going to go into effect for many of the southern states and lasted for maybe 30 years. Amendment number 24 to the Constitution. This basically is is a voting rights amendment saying that you cannot interfere with the right to vote. You cannot charge someone, you cannot make somebody pay to vote, and you cannot give any kind of a test. So we're going to test this, the Mississippi Summer Project of 1964, and again, this is white and black students going down and trying to set up freedom schools and getting people registered to vote. Famously, 3 of these students, 1 from the South and 2 from New York, go down during Freedom Summer, and they are murdered. The FBI ultimately is going to look into this, but 35 people end up being shot. There's bombs, there's mob attacks. 1,000 of these volunteers are arrested because, remember, voting gives you power. And 6 states end up being taken over by the federal government because of this violence and because of that Voting Rights Act. Malcolm X, very famous civil rights leader, born Malcolm Little, and he ends up going to prison, lives kind of a difficult life as a juvenile, and then finds religion, finds the Nation of Islam, and he is an amazing speaker, and he talks about the black nation to non-whites of the world. And he is going to spread this gospel. He's lived the life so he can talk to people. He becomes immensely popular. And then he goes to Mecca, and he kind of changes his ways. He comes back and he's more forgiving. He wants to bring people together, and he is ultimately assassinated. He said, "We must launch a cultural revolution to unbrainwash an entire people." He has some great quotes. "We must control the politics and the politicians of our community. It is incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of black against white. Rather, we are seeing today a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor. A man who stands for nothing will fall for anything. Stumbling is not falling. We are nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us." And then we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. So from the nonviolence of Martin Luther King and these other groups, people were frustrated, they were angry, things weren't moving fast enough, and Stokely Carmichael breaks from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he goes to a more violent message. His message, "We shall overrun instead of overcome, black power, and black is beautiful." If you remember, that was from the 1920s. So this is a result of, again, police, and sadly, most of this violence that occurs in the neighborhoods with the poorer, lower socioeconomic areas. 34 people were killed during the Watts riots in California, and over 1,000 people were injured. There were $40 million done in damage. The Black Panthers are going to be formed as a protective group, and they're founded in Oakland, California in 1966. These are the 2 founders, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. Bobby Seale, they meet in California. Bobby Seale was actually from Louisiana, and his family moves to California. And they are basically formed to protect the neighborhood. Okay, and they know the law. You can carry as long as it's not concealed. So they actually had coalitions with some of the white groups and with the Mexican groups, and they are going to have an agenda. It's a 10-point program, and they call for armed self-defense. And this is a new turn, but they scare people because they are armed. So you can see, and you can pause here and read through some of the programs that they put together. But it gets a little bit more violent, and some of the people that join the Black Panthers have records, and the FBI starts looking into the Black Panthers. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, said that the Black Panthers were an armed black revolution against the government of the United States, and they are going to infiltrate them and basically try to bring them down. They form an organization called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program. And this is, again, you can pause and read through this, but the police are actually going to be set against the Black Panthers. From October 67 to December 69, shootouts kill at least 10 Black Panthers and 2 police officers. There's over 360 indictments filed, and all of the 42 Panthers chapters across the country were investigated. Huey Newton is arrested, and he's arrested. There had been an altercation, there was shooting, and Huey was charged. The Panthers, of course, are going to show up at the courthouse, and the mantra was to free Huey. They're going to be joined by other groups, even children. In Chicago, a young man named Fred Hampton was organizing. He was very charismatic, brought in other groups, and the Chicago police end up coming to his home, and 100 rounds of ammunition are fired. Hampton is killed. Witness said he heard police officers say to one another, "Is Hampton dead?" And then they heard gunshots, and they heard another policeman say, "He is now." He was killed in his own bed. Angela Davis is another icon. She was a sympathizer with the Black Panthers, and the Soledad brothers were being tried. A young man goes into the courtroom, one of the brothers, named Jackson, and he takes hostage some of the jurors and the judge, Harold Haley, and he's got a shotgun taped to the judge's head, and as they're trying to leave, the police fire, and the shotgun goes off, and the judge is killed along with 3 of the other people that he was trying to free. Angela Davis was accused of giving him the guns. She escapes, and she's captured after 2 months, and then she's tried, and they try her actually for accessory to murder just because it was her gun. She said she didn't know what they were going to do with it, and ultimately this is she was a professor at Berkeley. She still is, and she is going to get a lot of support, and she is going to be found not guilty. Other groups will join in this fight.